Thank you very much for coming tonight on a beautiful, almost sunny night in New York, Old York, which is not always a given in the north of England, but we're enjoying it. Thank you also for coming and attending the event online. I have the pleasure to introduce you to the work of, I'm not shouting enough?
No, I'm saying like maybe because the video, the projector is covering you.
Ah, it's covering me. Okay. Is that better? Okay. In all my glory. Okay. Thank you for interrupting me. We are smiling, but the topic that we're working on in the Beyond Compliance Consortium very rarely lets us smiles. And partly is a smile that you see after working very intensely for 2 days in a workshop with extraordinary people, trying to encourage ourselves in a situation where we're dealing with armed conflicts throughout the world. We're obviously thinking of Gaza, we're thinking of Ukraine, but we're also thinking about what's happening in parts of Colombia, what's happening in Myanmar, what's happening in the DRC, in Sudan, South Sudan. And it's not necessarily a given that we will be smiling. So if you see us smiling tonight and in a good mood, it's because we gained some hope after 2 days of extensive workshop on the Beyond Compliance Consortium research program on building evidence for promoting restraint by armed actors. This consortium is built by 9 partner organizations, 3 universities, the University of York, the University of Glasgow, and Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and 6 organizations that are either human rights organizations or humanitarian organizations, different in their profiles, but we do share, all these 9 organizations, we share a common commitment for addressing harmony in our conflict. So our partner organizations that we call operational, because we don't want to use the term non-academic organizations. We don't really like to refer to things as non-something, although we do that a lot in international law, see non-state actors. Our partner organizations are the Diakonia International Humanitarian Law Center, the Watch List on Children and Armed Conflict, War Child Alliance, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, the Center Around Groups, Fight for Humanity. And the Beyond Compliance Consortium's research on building evidence on promoting restraint by armed actors is funded with UK international development money. It's an accountable grant that we bid for, and we were awarded after a competitive process. We are, as I said, an academic practitioner consortium, and the other aspect to us is that our expertise and specialism traverses the fields of international law, of political science, and of humanitarian and human rights protection. Thank you. The reason why I'm insisting so much on who we are, not just to advertise my amazing colleagues and their organizations, is because we understand that our positionality, who we are and what we do, informs, and positively and negatively, what and how we research, including as part of the Beyond Compliance Consortium. That means that the bids that we put together is co-productive, and the work that we do is co-productive and applied. We do aim to achieve conceptual, instrumental, and capacity bridging impact for our own partners, so for ourselves, but also beyond, for the actors that we are studying and with whom we're working. Be that humanitarian organizations, sometimes some governmental bodies that work in the humanitarian field and human rights field, and certainly local communities. We are also, as I said, multi and interdisciplinary, and that brings with it a lot of joys, but also every now and then some challenges because we don't necessarily share vocabulary. So we need to reach shared understanding of concepts, of how we implement them, of how we work with them. And that's what we did over the last 2 days. It was a joyful experience, and I'm not sarcastic. I usually am, but this time I'm not. It truly was. The other thing that very much stems from our position as researchers in academic institutions, but also in human rights and humanitarian organizations, is that we seek to center local voices, and we're specifically interested in people who are differently situated and are affected by armed conflict. And I can give you many examples, but I want to keep this as short as possible. But one example that I want to give is the fact that we are very proud to be joined in this consortium by researchers with lived experience of armed conflict, local researchers with lived experience of armed conflict. And lastly, something that we need to constantly remind ourselves as good researchers with a foot in practice and a foot in research in academia or policy, is that we need to remain reflexive about what we do and how we do, and understand that the impact we may have may not be achieved, but also that we may achieve impacts that will not necessarily be positive. So this is an ongoing process for us. Again, something that came out in various forms during the workshop. Okay, so you might be wondering, if you're joining us, what we're building on. We're obviously building on various bodies of literature. From international humanitarian law to international human rights law to general international law, but also on political science, on international relations, on behavioral sciences, maybe a tiny bit on psychology. We're also building on subfields of these disciplines, such as civil war studies. We're very proud to have some of the amazing experts working on this project. So specifically, we're building on a number of projects that we have conducted before on both the methodologies and the findings from this project, in addition to the literature, of course. And some of these projects are the From Words to Deeds research project that looked at how the behavior of armed actors, non-state armed groups, how the behavior of non-state armed groups matches or doesn't match with their statements, what they commit to do. We also build on dangerous liaisons. This is my favorite, absolute favorite title of a project happening for 14 this year, that looks at civilian agencies, armed groups, and international law. We build on the Generating Respect project that has researched the influence of religious leaders on parties to armed conflict towards compliance with humanitarian norms or non-compliance with humanitarian norms. We build on the Ritualizing Protection project, which is a co-productive ethnography conducted by my colleague Pier Giuseppe Parisi with an indigenous group in Colombia looking at spiritual protection mechanisms. And we are building on a really important study written by our colleague, co-written by our colleague Rebecca Sutton from the University of Glasgow and Monica Gillard, Beyond Compliance, International Humanitarian Law, Humanitarian Need, Civilian Harm in Armed Conflict. You'll see that we got inspired by this study also in our title. Again, we are building on the show. In addition to this project and our own experiences, we are building on the operational organization's expertise, their knowledge, the offices in the local knowledge. And this is what we mean by co-production. We're really trying from the bid stage to the conceptual framework, to how we operationalize the research, to how we conduct the field work, to how we publish and build impact in policy and practice, to really do this co-productively, academic practitioner informed and driven. Next slide. So what do we actually do? Which, in other words, what is our overarching research question? We ask what strategies have the most potential to prevent, reduce, and respond to negative lived experiences in armed conflict, and more broadly, to facilitate a protective environment in conflict. What that means is that we are seeking to answer this overarching question, which of course we're breaking down in 6 sub-questions, 2 work packages, one that looks at the negative lived experiences, that focuses on the concepts of civilian harm and humanitarian need, which we rework conceptually, and we refer to them as harm and need or need and harm. And the second research package focuses on the strategies, both legal and non-legal, that can be adopted or are being adopted that address the harm and need that we see on the ground. So the way we do this is we're employing what we call a bottom-up socio-legal approach. We obviously draw on a multitude of methods, from desk-based research and extensive literature reviews, including a systematic literature review of need and harm, to qualitative and quantitative research methods, such as semi-structured interviews and focus group discussions, potentially surveys. It depends whether the context demands that kind of a method. We are building, we have lawyers among us, so it would be impossible and ill-advised not to rely on doctrinal legal methods. So we do have strong doctrinal lawyers among us. And we do this, we employ these methods in order to capture empirically and conceptually the lived experiences of need and harm in our conflict, of mainly civilians, but we are also looking at categories of differently situated groups or specifically vulnerable groups that may not be classified as civilians. To give an example, child soldiers or specific women units within non-state armed groups that experience different types of risks and vulnerabilities compared to male fighters. We are conducting an extensive cross-disciplinary review of literature and practice, and we are employing a comparative case study-based approach. Our case study countries are Afghanistan, Colombia, the DRC, Myanmar, South Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, and Somalia. We have an interest in other case study contexts. We are informed by our partners who have local offices in other countries that are experiencing conflict, but these are the focus of the research at this stage. We think it's quite ambitious for this stage, so yeah. The second step will be to assess legal and non-legal frameworks, including what we call compliance and restraint. And I will pause here very briefly to say that we understand compliance to include compliance with international humanitarian law, compliance with international human rights law, and restraint, we understand it to be to include to refer to restraint from violence. So not just violations of IHL or human rights law, but violence, and for abuse when those are connected to armed conflict. So we look at this legal and non-legal frameworks, including compliance and restraint, that address or seek to address behaviors which generate negative lived experiences of armed conflict. Again, because we're employing multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary methodology, and we draw on theoretical concepts and findings from various disciplines. This allows us to understand how Rebecca Sutton likes to put it, the why of violence, not just what the impact of violence, but also why violence occurs in the first place. And also the factors, the influencers, state, non-state armed actors, local communities, international organizations, third states, and processes that shape armed actors and other actors' behavior in conflict. And finally, my gifted colleagues in the science and art of quantitative methods are drawing out the causal, definitely not casual, causal pathways between need and harm and compliance and restraint by developing a historical database, which will be open source. Okay, and yeah, we can go another. I will finish by saying that a few words about the workshop. Catherine Forton, the day before we started the workshop on Monday, said, what we'll be doing in this workshop is to put the work back into the workshop. And we certainly did that. Reflexively, with passion, we're wiped out, pretty much all of us, but happy. And then my colleague Jamie Williams said, as a conclusion to the workshop, in the very last session, he said, what we discovered in this workshop is that we're all in the same book, we're all in the same chapter, and pretty much on the same page. That is to say that we have a profound agreement and commitment to center the voices of those who live through armed conflict, and also to see strategies that address this harm and need that are linked to the law, but also those that go beyond the law. So with that, I'm just going to hand you over to the wonderful Professor Anastasia Shesterina, who will be moderating and chairing the fireside chat, in which you will hear from members of our research team, each representing another partner organization. Thank you very much.
It is an incredible pleasure to welcome you all to this fire chat that can actually give us a more concrete sense of the movement from these narrow and perhaps even less acceptable notions of harm and need to much broader approaches that we are engaging with and the strategies associated with them, all informed by lived experiences of armed conflict. And this is the kind of goal that we have for this discussion that will take place in the next hour. The fireside chat is called From Non-Compliance to Beyond Compliance in War, Problematizing Harm, Need, and Interventions. And to start this problematization, we have Catherine Forton really diving into these kind of narrow ways of seeing harm, and why is it that we need to move beyond them. Catherine.
Thank you. Well, I've been given 5 minutes, so quite how deep I'll be able to dive, I'm not sure. But yes, I will perhaps do a bit of scene setting. So both in terms of the discussions we've had, out of which the designs emerged, and the methodologies also emerged. So I think most people in the room and online are largely aware about different definitions of civilian harm, and how the term civilian harm is sometimes defined rather narrowly to relate largely to casualties relating from military operations, so deaths and casualties relating often from airstrikes, to wider definitions of civilian harm, where there's quite a contested grey zone going on about the extent to which we should also be taking into account reverberating effects of military operations. So, for example, whether or not this concept civilian harm can also hold concepts like psychological injury or indirect effects to people's livelihoods. And then, of course, you have even wider definitions of civilian harm, which seek to widen the lens even more by thinking about people living in proximity to military actors and the kind of harm that may emerge. And when looking at this, over the last days, we found it really important to contextualize. So I'm going to give you an example. If you take a look at the UNAMA Protection of Civilian reports that came out year on year, quarterly, mid-year, and then annually, you can see that the vast majority of those reports was devoted to civilian casualties, to IEDs, to the targeting of different individuals. And then at the end of the report, what they did was they had a couple of pages entitled Protection of Civilians, which very often then listed other violations of IHL and sometimes human rights law. So I think from these reports, we can see two things. One, we see a lot of space being given to deaths and injuries and much less space in terms of the report itself to other things. But I think what these reports also show us is that when you channel a view of conflict through a legal lens, you can miss stuff. So this is one of the things that our project does. It turns it upside down by starting in a socio-legal tradition with the lived experiences of lived negative experiences of armed conflict by civilians, and then moving on to see how that maps on to harm. And in doing so, because you're not channeling your analysis through the law, you end up seeing where the law connects, where the law doesn't connect, where the law might be a useful tool of intervention, where the law won't be useful or may not be a useful tool of intervention, but harm is still there. So it allows a much deeper, I think, vision and view and framing of harm and need. I think I've spoken for 5 minutes, so I think I should probably pass on to Joshua. But I hope that that's helpful in terms of explaining, and I know that the other speakers are going to pick up on some of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Catherine Gordon. I forgot to say University of Utrecht.
Oh.
And in fact, we will be building directly on that to start thinking about how is that movement from the narrow conception of harm toward a much broader understanding of harms and needs, particularly when it comes to protracted conflicts, where, for instance, airstrikes are not necessarily the core concern in terms of the longer time frame. It would be really good to hear about that kind of a shift also temporally. So we'll hear right now from Dr. Joshua Neo from the Diakonia International Humanitarian Law Center.
Thank you. I think what I'll do is I'll actually situate the conversation within the area that I am mostly involved, and that's Eastern Central Africa, where I'm a regional legal advisor for the IHL Center. And so this really comes from a context of working within that space and from interaction with humanitarian actors within that space. And I'll try and move from some more specific to broad, and then to some other aspects where we see harm actually existing, harm being exacerbated by armed conflict. The first one, of course, is food insecurity, and I'll just highlight three. The first one is food insecurity in armed conflict, which has increasingly, especially in our work, really come forth as one of those aspects that beyond usual aspects of harm that are related to whether it is airstrikes, whether it is attacks, we see much deeper aspects of food insecurity manifest in different areas where armed conflict has been on for a long time. And right now, I think about, of course, Sudan, which is an increasing hunger context as we speak. There are a lot of aspects of food insecurity that have been exacerbated by the instability that has happened over a long period of time. And this captures aspects beyond what we usually talk about in the context of international humanitarian conflict. We are dealing with issues around accessibility to food, dealing with issues around affordability, utilization, and interruption of food systems, different aspects, of nutrition and access to food. And so a lot of these, of course, are not, for many IHL lawyers, these are not captured specifically within IHL norms. But from my interaction with a lot of humanitarian actors, these broader aspects of food insecurity are very critical and very important. And for us as actors in that space, it has been important for us as we think about the wider aspects of food insecurity. How do we capture, these other aspects with regard, for example, food sources and food systems? How do we capture these also within the context of and analyzing the impact of armed conflict? The other, of course, is now moving away from more specific to much more systemic impacts. We've also been able to see a lot of systemic impacts, especially because of prolonged armed conflict. And these systemic impacts have, particular effects, for example, on livelihoods. So the loss of access to livelihood is one of those wider problems that we have seen as a result of prolonged armed conflict. Again, not usually captured within your typical idea of harm and need within the context of armed conflict, but wider impacts. And access to livelihood has other things attached to it. For example, the collapsing of land tenure systems. Land tenure systems are particularly important, especially in Sudan and South Sudan, when it comes to agriculture and the ability for persons to earn a living and be able to access food. So livelihoods has become another wider issue that has come from prolonged armed conflict. And so another systemic issue, another issue is also access to justice. Again, another broader area of harm that we have observed. And access to justice is usually, again, from prolonged armed conflict. You increasingly have, as we've seen in South Sudan, a disenchantment and a dissatisfaction with the existing justice systems because they've collapsed as a result of prolonged armed conflict. So there are a lot of conversations around alternative systems because of the desperation about broken systems from armed conflict. So, and again, another wider aspect of the effects of the armed conflict. The last one is more looking at, in a sense, how armed conflict, again, exacerbates already existing challenges. From, again, our interactions with different humanitarian actors in the field. Climatic shocks and, of course, the effect of climate change has been another big issue that they have raised as priorities that they have to address. And, Ethiopia particularly and South Sudan is where we have had the exacerbation of the already existing shocks from climate change actually having a much more adverse impact because of existing instability and existing armed conflict. So again, allowing, forcing us as actors to think much more broadly beyond, again, attacks and usual harm, but begin to think about how, in a sense, these prolonged conflicts sit in the space of, already serious harm seen from climate change and climatic shocks. So I'll stop there. I guess there'll be many more questions for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua. And that was a fantastic overview for us to think about not only time, but also perhaps immediacy, notions of urgency, and shift our attention to systematic aspects as well, which is really, really helpful. But how does that translate into concrete lived experiences of armed conflict? And here I'd like to pass on to Noon from the University of York to speak particularly about the research in Myanmar. 5 minutes.
So thank you. As I'm from Myanmar, and in the context of Myanmar, after the independence of the British, there were loss of the armed conflict and civil war in Myanmar due to armed conflict between the military regime, former military regime and current ruling military regime and ethnic armed organization, EAOs, the local people and civilians. The reason why I use the local people and the civilian is that if the international and also Myanmar people recognized as civilian or not included Rohingya. So that's why that I use the local people. Because of Rohingya community are also local people of Myanmar. So the civilian and local people have fled their homes as the IDP internet displaced people for decades, for 7 decades already. Since the military coup in 2021, serious fightings has occurred both in ethnic states and 7 states and 7 regions. I like to focus the forced conscription current facing problem in Myanmar. Forced conscription by the military regime, current ruling military regime has caused much need and harm among the different and diverse population in Myanmar. So that's why, because of the forced conscription by the military regime, it can be harmed in battle or killed. This including the children, women, and other people. The people who fled conscription, they fled and joined with the ethnic armed organizations and became target of the junta. The junta who destroyed their homes and harmed their family. While skillfully from conscription has also caused mass displacement both within Myanmar and externally. So like me. There are secondary impact of this impact of refugee into ethnic into the ethnic states and the region, including food scare, especially including the food scarcity and potential identity conflict. Because of the especially IDP who are from the urban area to the ethnic states area, to the coastal region and the highland area. So because of the ethnic people who are living in the coastal region and the highland area, they have their own cultural literature and identity. So most of the urban people, when they move, they flee into the ethnic area. So they try to marry with the they try to marry with the ethnic women. So that's the one of the harm of the forced conscription in the ethnic area. And also harm families of the conscripted family members. The people who was under the warrant list for the forced conscription. So if he or she fled from their area, so their family members were threatened by the military regime. As the civilian, the loss of workforce, as the civilian harm, the loss of workforce in the has led to the SME, small and medium, entrepreneur, factory closure, and the extreme poverty line in that proportionally impact women, girls, and children and elder persons. The cause of the fleeing to the Thai-Myanmar border area and the China-Myanmar border area, this is the height. This was the height. So that's why that they costed on the they costed on the fleeing cost. So that's why that they couldn't spend the money for their food and their shelter. Especially vulnerable prisoners. The ship international before the forced conscription by the military regime, international community, especially donors and the international organization support to the vulnerable prisoners. political prisoners and their family members. After the forced prostration by the military regime, the ship of the priority has left political prisoner vulnerability. So regarding with the education armed conflict between the military regime and the ethnic armed organization, especially oppositions. After that time military coup in 2021, not only the ethnic armed organization, but also the PDF, with the name of the PDF, Tibet Defense Force. So that's why, because of high escalation, high tension and escalation, the armed conflict in the area, and so that's why most of the currently 70% of the military bases and 70% of the military bases and military camps were seized and captured by the opposition. So that's why the military regime used the airstrikes to the civilians area. If they airstrike to the civilians area, PDFs, Tibet Defense Force, and ethnic armed organization back from their offensive to the military regime. So that's why that the military regime, airstrikes to the civilian area, targeting to the civilian area, especially schools and hospitals. So that's why that before the forced conscription and after the forced conscription, most of the medical officer, people they flee to the overseas. So that's why that lack of medical officers in the hospitals and school also, and also teacher also they fled from the school and then to the China border area and the China border area. And so that's why that because of the vaccination, positive vaccination in children in conflict area, currently 90% of Myanmar area are covered by the by the armed conflicts. So that's why that it has caused poor hygiene and the low capacity for health treatment and increase in case of leprosy, and also including the multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. So it is feared that further impact of this health crisis and appear in the years to come. The current crisis in Myanmar, with both sides into their hardlines and humanitarian situation growing, worse every hours and every day. The people, especially civilians and the local people, the people of Myanmar deserve no less.
Thank you so much, Noon. It's a massive undertaking to walk us through the effects of an incredibly complex context, but also, thanks to your deep knowledge of that context, pinpoint a key issue, forced conscription, that otherwise could have been overlooked. And we appreciate that very much. And I think as we are starting to focus on these kinds of issues that are accessible through contextually sensitive research, contextually sensitive knowledge production and practice, it would be also really, really good to hear about another key issue area around particularly turning to rights-based approaches, thinking about questions around child recruitment, child use, etc. From Robert Bloom, War Child UK.
Thanks very much. Indeed, over the last 2 days in our workshop, we've been talking a lot about vulnerable communities, and children are extremely vulnerable in conflict. So we've had quite a focus on that. So if I just start by giving a bit of a picture about how we understand how conflict makes children vulnerable. In peaceful societies, and stable societies, for the most part, a child will grow up in an environment where they have layers of protection that surround them, from their family, their extended family, siblings. When they attend school, they have teachers, friends looking out for them. There are institutions in the local government that protect the child. But in conflict situations, and especially in protracted conflict situations, those layers of protection are stripped away. So for the reasons that you were all describing, a school may be destroyed, community displaced, there may be forced conscriptions you're describing there, where children are extremely vulnerable to the very worst excesses. So organizations like War Child and other child protection agencies seek to put those layers of protection back in place around children. But we also recognize that we're a small part of the picture. And the biggest, most important actors are the community and the state, and those who are obliged to protect children and to protect civilians. So we have what we call this rights-based approach, where we seek to support children and their families and communities to claim their rights, to say, I have human rights and they need to be delivered. But we also work with the government, the local authorities, the national authorities, to understand their obligations and to deliver on those obligations, to protect and provide services. So that might not always be possible. And from the example you just gave, there might be an absolutely antagonistic relationship of the state to society. But that doesn't stop the state having those obligations. They remain. And there are instances where we are able to work with authorities to get them to understand, to act on their obligations. So just a couple of quick examples of where we try to do that. In Iraq, there are currently tens of thousands of families and children who either were associated with the Islamic State group several years ago, or they were perceived to have been associated with the Islamic State group. And they are now seeking to return to their communities from which they were displaced by the conflict. Now, you could say understandably, because of the atrocities of the Islamic State, many of the people that were affected by that violence in those communities don't want those families to come back. They consider them to have forfeited their rights, and by extension that the children have forfeited their rights. Now, believing in human rights and children's rights, it's not possible. No child can have their rights forfeited. They are what every individual has and holds for their whole life. So we work with the community partner organizations and the communities, firstly, to understand what they've been through and to hold a space open where they're able to articulate the terrible things that they went through and why they feel this way. And then we introduce in other partners and people who can lead us through a discussion to really work through what it means if you can keep a community displaced. How will that affect long-term stability? Will that resolve? Will that lead to a peaceful society? And this project has been successful in evolving some of the community opinions so that they're much more willing for these families to come back. And through working with local social workers and state institutions, we've managed to build a groundswell of support for return to take place. So in a bottom-up way, we're trying to engage the state to allow families back. Another quick example is that of South Sudan, where we're kind of working in the other direction. So in South Sudan, for many years, there have been rights violations committed by the state army. And there's an agreement in place between the United Nations and the government of South Sudan to stop those violations. But how do you get that to happen after so many years? Well, we've been supporting workshops that bring together the government army, other ministries, civil society organizations, to come together and discuss what's going on and where the government can be held to account, to be forced to explain why they are not necessarily being successful in ending child recruitment or other rights violations. And the community can be heard. And critically, where there's a lack of knowledge about what those obligations are, the partners we work with are able to hand over the right documents and the right laws and to talk about what an obligation is. So where it's possible, and I reiterate, it's not possible in every situation, the understanding of obligations and rights can be brought back to life. And not just using the language of rights, but the fundamental concept in every society of why children should be protected. So that's one of the big things we've been discussing, and it's cool that some of this work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rocco. You are actually painting now a deeply social picture of what is involved in terms of bringing community norms, community practices, which we quite often romanticize and idealize, and which can, through this kind of deep engagement, reveal other sides, and then kind of coming up with, again, social solutions, deeply social solutions to what can be done to restructure these multi-layered protection structures that used to exist, but no longer sometimes do. How does that then feed this bottom-up approach? How does that feed into the UN Children and Armed Conflict understanding and kind of attempts to address these kinds of harms, maybe others? We'll hear from, on this question, from Bethany Ellis, Watch List on Children and Armed Conflict.
Yes, thank you. So Watch List also has this child-specific focus, and we engage mostly through the UN level and their Children Armed Conflict agenda and the unique set of tools that have been established under this framework to support and mitigate the impact, the harmful impact of armed conflicts on children. So Watch List itself is a network organization. We have 16 members that are comprised of both humanitarian and human rights organizations, and we're really seeking to end grave violations against children and protect their rights in war. So in talking about grave violations, we are aligning with the UN's UN identified grave violations here. So we're talking specifically about the recruitment and use of children, killing and maiming of children, rape and other forms of sexual violence, abduction, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access. So in the more than 25 years since the UN began this agenda, these tools have worked to streamline data collection and analysis, often informed by partners on the ground, including civil society, around the impact of war on children, has spurred conflicting parties to take concrete time-bound action plans to end grave violations and prevent them from recurring, and also to strengthen the international norms around the protection of children, including through adopting 13 thematic resolutions on children armed conflict at the Security Council, the most recent one being around protecting education in conflict. So I think we've been asked to look at a specific context here in bringing in Israel and Palestine, and how these tools kind of have or have not been a successful intervention in that situation. And it's an interesting one for us because despite having been included in the annual reports of the Secretary General with information about violations that children were experiencing, in every year since 2006, there's a crucial piece that's been missing in order to activate some of the tools that are available to help spur this change. And that crucial piece is the listing of parties to conflict as perpetrators of grave violations. So what does listing do? Listing means being included and named specifically as a party to conflict that has committed a pattern of grave violations against children, and being named by being included in the annex of the Secretary General's annual report. For one of 5 of those 6 grave violations. So the only one that doesn't include listing is denial of humanitarian access. And what happens when a party is listed is that whole context situation then formally gets established under the monitoring and reporting mechanism. So that means that UNICEF and the highest UN representative in country then have a formal mandate to establish the system for documenting, verifying, and reporting about the harm that's happening for children, and also to engage with parties to conflict to create these time-bound and concrete plans, both to end the violation, to improve their compliance with international law, to prevent them from recurring, specifically through taking actions to reestablish and strengthen that overall protective environment for children. It also sends a very important signal. National governments, member states, and the international community, they're embarrassed. They don't want to be named and listed alongside actors such as the Taliban, Boko Haram, the Islamic State, as a violator of children's rights in war. So the current situate, oh, and the final thing that it does also is through the reports that are generated by the monitoring and reporting mechanism and through the country task force that has the mandate to implement the system. They also bring reports to a working group of the Security Council on children around conflict, who then have additional actions that they can take to engage with the parties to conflict, with the governments, and also to call for specific actions by relevant UN bodies such as the Security Council. The current escalation that we're seeing in Israel and Palestine clearly makes the case for the need for all available tools to be brought to the table to address the dire harm that children are experiencing. And this has implications not only for children in Israel and Palestine, but for all children living in conflict in all of those situations that appear on the Children in Conflict reports. What will be interesting to see with the case studies that we have identified, which of course Palestine isn't one, is that in all the cases that we are examining in this project, there is an MRM established, the monitoring reporting mechanism. There are listed parties. So there is already this formal established mechanism around investigating harms for children and engaging these parties. And in some of these situations, there are action plans with specific perpetrators as well to end these violations. So it becomes really clear from watch list standpoint that all parties need to be held to the same standards when it comes to the protection of children. So we are very excited to see what this research brings from that level of intervention as well.
Thank you so much, Bethany. It actually adds a completely different dimension to the community-based bottom-up discussions that we've had of really powerful mechanisms of international norm building, even naming and shaming, as much as we have debated the effectiveness of those mechanisms that seem to be so relevant and that we need to engage with, we can't simply discard, and clearly in this case are particularly potent. But where does all of that lead us in terms of thinking about non-state armed groups? Pascal Beaugrave, Center on Armed Groups, perhaps you can give us a little bit of a sense of how we think about that.
Yes, thank you. I will highlight 3 points that reflect a little bit the practice of engagement with armed groups to change the behavior and promote respect with IHL that is drawn on the research we do at the center, but also on practice of different organizations. And there are questions actually that we will address through the project. In more depth than what has been done so far. And I will just highlight three points in the next minute. So first, I think we know that there is a variety of actors from local communities to NGO to UN agencies that actually engage directly with armed groups to influence their behavior. And in a recent study that we published at the center on Mali, in central Mali, as part of the relation between armed groups and civilians, we know that, or we found that there are local communities that engage with jihad groups on a daily basis to, have access to, for access to the delivery of aid, or, for example, to lift blockade or embargoes that were imposed by the jihadi and restore some kind of freedom of movement of people, goods and livestock. So these efforts were facilitated by international NGOs, but also by religious leaders, the High Council of Islamic Council of Mali. So there are this practice of engagement that even are directed through quite hard to reach armed groups, that many of them are listed as terrorist organizations. So it adds also complexity and more difficulty to engage. Similarly, in Somalia, you have traditional elders in areas controlled by Shabab, which is another Islamist armed group, that also have been engaging with this group to facilitate the release of hostages, aid workers, or soldiers abducted by or detained by Al-Shabaab, but also to facilitate access for the delivery of aid, especially in situation of famine. And it is often a situation where you don't have many international actors. And I think this is also what the project, Changing Respect project has shown, is the role of religious leaders, the role of local communities that often is a bit under-documented, a bit under the radar, but it is very instrumental in changing the behavior or promoting at least some change. In Mali also, we did some studies as part of the World Studies project where we looked at the Tuareg rebellion back, a couple of years ago that were controlling territory in the north. And we found that it was a combination of different actors. So you have international NGOs, you have ICRC doing training on IHL for this armed group, but you had also reports from human rights organizations that were reporting abuse that really helped, I think, to pressure these groups that were very sensitive to their reputation. But also you have the activism of lawyers or legal advisors within the armed group. It was interesting to see that this armed group is actually legal advisor. They've established a human rights commission. They have even contracted international lawyers to basically help them to advise or guide their own practice when it comes to protection of civilians or IHL. And it's interesting to see that it is actually this combination, I think, of actors, of pressure, of factors that may trigger some change within the armed groups. But you have other actors like diaspora, like refugee communities, like even non-conventional or unconventional actors like other armed groups who are allied with armed groups as part of coalitions. So often there is this kind of peer pressure. We have also armed groups that are supported by sponsor states or third-party states that have also some leverage. So I think part of the work that we will look at, but also the practitioners, is really key to understand and identify the source of leverage from different corners before actually making a strategy of engagement. So it's really important to have a good understanding of who has influence on the group, how decision-making is made, and how we can maybe, use these kind of factors to promote better respect for IHL. Maybe the second point quickly is that these actors use different approach, different strategies. I talk about human rights organizations that use more this naming and shaming tactic, but you have training like ICRC, you have dialogue or confidential dialogue, you have training, I said, capacity building, sometimes direct assistance. Some organizations, for example, support armed groups to develop their code of conduct to be in line with international standards. So that's also another area of work. And for us, I think it's interesting to look at what approach works best or how we can analyze comparatively this different approach. Even if it sounds a bit odd in current times, but actually engagement, this constructive engagement can actually work and be effective. You have many armed groups that have committed to respect IHL or special thematics through different means. Some have not respected their words, but some have actually complied or at least implemented some of their actions, and that led to tangible outcomes, protected outcomes for the population, such as the release of detainees, reintegration of child soldiers, the destruction of stockpile, anti-personnel mines. So you have concrete deeds or actions that have been taken by armed groups as a result of this engagement by various actors. And I think the question for us is to know and try to understand what is successful, why it's failed, how we can make sense of these various factors, this variation, but also who has leverage, and again, what approach or strategy has the most potential for influencing armed groups. So I think that's some of the questions that we will address in the next couple of years, and I hope we'll find some response.
Thank you so much, Pascal. And that actually leads us to the discussion of how is it that we try and understand these things? How do we co-produce knowledge with armed actors? And I hope that Mehmet Belti from Fight for Humanity will help us start thinking about that in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. It's very difficult for me to talk after Pascal because we have been working together with for 20 years. Now we are separated, but we're still on the, as you said, almost on the same page. So, as implemented, must be focusing on human rights in the areas or territories controlled by armed state actors. So, the objective is to promote human rights in this area. So no one can be left behind, or the rights cannot be suspended, even under control of the armed groups. And the armed groups, if they control territories or de facto authorities, they can change them. But rights are there, and they have obligations. Even though, like a state, sometimes almost a state, sometimes not stateless, but they have obligations. So we know that some armed groups are providing education to hundreds of thousands of people, and they are providing services, hospital, education, or other type of services, but sometimes they commit violations. So we would like to address this violation with these armed groups as humanity, and before coming to the project. And we are slated to use another use for these languages of engaging the armed groups for many years, and still I don't disagree, but I think there's another way to look into this, with engaging group. So I think armed groups are very active, proactive in engaging us. Even we say that we're pretending that we are, well, yes, we go to them, but when they invite us or they accept us, but they also do a lot of efforts, and they have their own agenda, and they accept us to go in there, and they take the risk, even as life risk, to meet us in the jungle or in the different areas, and they take risks to come us because they have an agenda. Because they also want, as Pascal said, also they want to change, and they want to learn, or they want to communicate sometimes their own agenda. Therefore, I think it's a kind of bi-directional work with the armed groups. Is not, and of course, there are some armed groups are tough, they are deliberately, they have violated laws or rules, but there are other armed groups also who would like to respect better. Also, they are in need of support. They are coming to you for the support. So therefore, we're trying to respond. I would like to give an example, not really extend too much intervention. We recently have these days finishing a study or research on women, peace and security in Yemen and in Myanmar, with two armed groups in Myanmar, with Karen and Karenis. And in Yemen with three armed and political actors who are controlling the Yemen. And we use another methodology. It's not our invention, but we call it participatory research. And we involve the armed state actors or these armed actors in the research, or we conducted together, and they accepted. Or they accepted to be involved, and they also participated in the methodology. They participated into the questions, how the research should be conducted. So they were engaged from the beginning in how to conduct the research. And then the objective was to see where they are with their women, peace and security agenda, and what they are missing, and how they are going to address these gaps. So we did develop this. You can find online the Burmese one is already online. The Yemen one will come this day, next week, maybe. Research already finalized. But it was very interesting and to see how. Because I give an example, sometimes everybody was very reluctant, even the donor was very reluctant that he will engage, or the Houthis in Yemen would accept to work on this issue, women, peace and security. But with a positive approach, and then also we have been able, or they have been able to convince us together that this will be also in the favor of the population of the. So the Houthi not only accepted us that we work, they participated into the research. There are 6 of the highest level in the leadership members accepted to answer the questions. I want to say it's possible. We are all human. You are listening to me. You will ask me questions. We will learn from each other, and we will leave this room differently. We are not the same. I'm not talking about philosophic speech, but if you interact with our groups with several years, so you will learn from them, they will learn from you, and then we believe in the change. That's what I'm trying to say. The change is possible if really I mean, there are several ways of maintaining this dialogue, and if you are not trust to them, and they are not trusting to you, and if you are able to create this environment for the change is possible. So as fight for humanity, I do believe that we also can engage on the human rights, and not only, but it's change possible. Therefore, we are very happy to be of this, and to find out also why they are respecting, why they are referring. And sometimes people ask me, why I'm doing this research. I say, you would like to find out they are fighting 365 days a year. They maybe commit violation during 50 days, but other 300 days they are not committing violations. Let's see why they are not committing these days violations. Why? So to simplify a little bit, to understand, not because they're permanently, systematically violating, but they're also doing some other type of work to refrain from violations for their own interests, for their own population. But we have to understand this. What are the factors? So I hope that we can contribute.
Thank you so
we
much.
are going to have 3 countries, 3 case studies: Colombia, Yemen, and Northeast Syria. So, thank you.
So we are starting to get a much more complex picture of pressures, various pressures from, including within armed groups, even through research engagements and that kind of a dialogue. But our understanding of agency in armed conflict has also expanded and deepened further to think about other strategies than what we've discussed so far. When dialogue is not possible, or when dialogue is not sufficient, and yet communities manage to protect themselves. Mark Linning from Center for Civilians in Conflict will hopefully give us a little bit of a sense of what does that mean in Ukraine specifically.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to focus my 5 minutes a little bit on the aspect of what civilians in those scenarios are doing. As you mentioned, of course, it's clear that the armed actors are primary duty bearers for addressing harm and need. But of course, that does not mean in practice that civilians and communities don't do anything and remain passive. In many scenarios, obviously, you have contested areas where no armed actor has full control. And civilians are not waiting for anyone, neither for us nor for the armed actors when it comes to save the lives of their families or their own lives and to do something about their protection. So bearing that in mind, I think it's really good that that this project, and I think the humanitarian sector in general and other sectors too, really look at civilians and communities also really as expert agents of protection and see how we can support what they're doing already, but really look what they are, not trying to impose externally solutions, but build on what they're doing already to better address harm and need. So that's very relatable, of course, to this project as well. Maybe just to give you a few kind of aspects how this works and how we have been seeing it at Civic in different contexts, including Ukraine. Of course, here we have efforts by communities that are totally independent from armed actors. So, for example, not so long ago, in different research papers on Ukraine, it was quite amazing to see how communities, because the Ukrainian authorities were not able to immediately react, maybe in February 2022 when the Russian invasion happened, how they formed informal networks regarding helping maybe people with disability, people who couldn't evacuate in time to do so, how they found measures to maybe leave different resources, food, petrol, gas, in houses that they evacuated, but then informing other community members who were still there to make use of those things, how they adopted very quickly very practical approaches to protect themselves from airstrikes, from hostilities, you know, flying two-wall rule and staying really away from outer parameters of their houses, grab bags, etc. So really practical things, because yes, the military, in this case, the Ukrainian armed forces, was not ready or able to be everywhere and have maybe also the structures and focus to do that for them. So that's, of course, one aspect of self-protection. I do want to go add another aspect when, of course, communities themselves also lead dialogues. And I think Pascal and also Rocco alluded to that already, when they then themselves lead dialogues to address protection issues with the armed actors themselves. So this is another aspect whereby it can be issues that relate to the behavior of the armed actor. Problematic behavior may be linked to IHL and other applicable norms, but it can also be issues that the armed actor they are having a dialogue with can do to protect them from harm or need issues by third parties, by the other actors. On the Ukrainian scenario, Civic has been working in establishing different community protection groups, for example, who then talk with the Ukrainian military about what can they do better to protect the civilians from Russian attack in terms of equipment of shelters, access to early warning system, air raid sirens, etc. So there's those two dimensions of issues. And that's why we're really excited to be part of this, because here we look at that legal norms and what they say, but again, it goes beyond that aspect as well. And we have a lot to learn from civilians communities in terms of what they're doing already. And of course, we try to contribute and strengthen existing efforts. Yeah, I guess time is flying. I don't want to take too much because we have Q&A as well. So
thank you so much. I'll just bring these rich comments together very briefly to ask ourselves, so what does starting from wide-ranging lived experiences of armed conflict actually help us achieve? And we already see that it helps us move from a focus on casualties to contextually relevant questions such as access to food and justice, from short-term, immediate, to long-term systemic impacts, and even challenges that existed prior to and became exacerbated by the armed conflict. From issues that capture international headlines to much more hidden processes and such as that require contextually sensitive knowledge, forced conscription, multi-layered social structures involved in protection, and many others. It also helps us move from this emphasis that still exists on external intervention to multidimensional engagement by local communities and even influence of actors from within armed groups themselves. And as a result, to respond already very briefly to our main research question that Joanna introduced, you know, from this kind of separate view of different top-down and bottom-up approaches to understanding complex intersections between specific strategies that all in combination, of course, will impact in one way or another the behavior of our armed actors. And that includes international organizations in third states, but it also includes various local actors and armed actors as well. I'll stop here and open it to Q&A, and we really look forward to hearing what sparked your interest. And that, of course, includes our participants online. Don't be shy. And there you have it.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm from the Philippines. Yeah, you know, Philippines are so many conflicts. From the People's Army, from MNLF, Abu Sayyaf, ISIS, we have so many conflicts. But we have this process also that the government is doing. We have this process. So right now, in the Mindanao area, we have this peace agreement in the Philippines. But the CPP and PA already have this conflict with their government for 55 years. But little by little, the government is really addressing the issue or making solutions to that problem of what is causing this conflict also. And like surrender, the government have a program that the CPP can surrender or surrender their guns like that. But the big problem is really, did you consider also the conflict of extractive industries? Because, you know, armed conflict, armed comes from the minerals under the earth. So it's before the materials come from under the earth, and there is already conflict in the extractive industries. Maybe you can consider that also. Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. Perhaps, are there any more hands up? We could actually start answering questions one by one. Would anybody have a sense of how to think about, for instance, illegal mining in Colombia in the context of our project, criminal gang activities, other extractive industries that are not simply adding to the already complex armed conflict dynamics, but shaping those dynamics profoundly? Any thoughts from the panel?
I can give some immediate things. So I think one of the things I find really interesting about our project, and I guess I'm also, of course, talking as a lawyer, because I can't get rid of my legal discipline, but at the same time, what I find so fascinating is that working with non-lawyers and with this methodology, it opens your eyes to what the law holds and what the law doesn't hold. I think one of the things I've repeatedly noticed in my project on civilian agency is that there's so much, well, if we're talking about lived experience, there's so much lived experience that exists. And what I think in political science literature, you'd often call a meso level. So you've got the micro level of the individuals, and then you've got the macro level of the armed actors. And then in the middle, you've got all kinds of stuff going on, right? So you've got all kinds of other actors, and they're generally organized in different ways. So in that middle category, I would put the civilian protection committees that you've talked about. I'd also put kind of organized civilian humanitarian actors. I might put civilians who've gathered together to engage in governance initiatives that are separate from the armed group, but are somehow sitting in between the armed actor and civilians. You might also put, we've discussed other actors that can be exploitative or do harm in these 2-day workshops. So sort of lorry drivers, other private actors. And I think that's where your extractive industry sits. So it's in the middle. That's how I see it. Now, the interesting thing from a legal analysis perspective, particularly an IHL perspective, is that IHL has a bit of a blind spot for this meso layer, because IHL deals with the macro by addressing its obligations to the armed actors, and it deals very well with the micro, very well, we can question that. It deals with the micro by dealing with individuals and thereby civilians, but it doesn't have an evaluative lens that allows us to see the meso. And this is why the project for me as a lawyer is very interesting, because this is a good example, I think, of where as lawyers we have to think carefully about how the law in these instances can address things like extractive industries. And I'm going to stop talking because I'm talking too long. But what I want to say is there could be two answers. On the one hand, you may say that a corporate actor has its own IHL obligations, and I think this is a new and expanding area. I see more people looking at it. But also, we have a big strand of our research on governance. And there you would say, I think that the armed actor, whether it be an armed group or a state, has obligations that require it to somehow take note of and control the abusive or explosive behaviors at the meso level. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah. No, please, Mark.
Maybe linked to what you said, extractive industries, of course, oftentimes use also their own, whether it's private security, sometimes even private military companies to then, let's say, indirectly or maybe implicitly get involved in existing armed conflicts, or maybe even if it's below the legal threshold of an armed conflict, of course, getting involved in violence with significant human rights or IHL implications and harm. And of course, holding those security actors then, even if they're private, accountable and using what is out there, whether it's the Montreux document, the International Code of Conduct, and of course then also the industries and the states, and maybe that own the industries or where this conflict takes place, like in the Philippines. That's part of also the I guess the analytical scope that needs to be looked at as well, right? Because they are not only the traditional actors that are involved, but you have those kind of actors as well, and the harm and the need from their behavior can be significant. So it should be part of the things to look at. Yeah.
I think Joshua had an addition.
Yeah, just a quick thought, and then there's a question behind. In essence, to add to what she said, and thinking very specifically about one of the contexts in which I operate, which is the DRC. Extractives is a huge factor, not just as part of an impact of armed conflict, but as a driver of conflict itself. So an analysis of extractives actually starts from the very beginning, even before we get into armed conflict, as a driver of armed conflict, and then seeing through conflict, and then in a sense, if there's a point after conflict, how it continues to be a prevailing problem and a wider problem beyond what we usually see under IHL, which in a sense introduces the need for an analytic frame that she's proposing, that meso level, which hopefully addresses these different phases of its impact in society.
Yeah. So building on what you said, this is how our workshop went, basically, just that you're getting a flavor of how we build on each other's thoughts. I think in addition to the actor level that you have spoken about, where extractives comes in, the factors that Joshua spoke about that may explain the behavior of an art actor, may drive the behavior of an art actor in certain cases, so material resources may actually drive. It comes into our project in one other dimension, and that is, what kind of strategies do you use to address this kind of behavior that is driven by material resources? Which strategies that engage on a humanitarian dialogue and simply make use of the law, IHL, human rights, or would that be enough? Can we think of strategies outside this that may actually shape that? What would those be? You could go from the small ones to the big ones. Consumers that use those things that are extracted, and we know who, all of us with our nice laptops and phones, but also responsibilities and how if we do use those. I'm talking about governmental policies in the global north, for example, that has an impact. So these are things that they may not become our main focus. We still have a focus on compliance and restraint, but we understand that there are bigger things and different things beyond IHL and human rights law that may play into why someone does something and how you can affect their behavior. Yes.
Thank you so much. And because this research is contextually driven, those contexts where this is particularly relevant will certainly incorporate this into our thinking. So I know we have two questions, one online and one from the room. If you don't mind, could we start with the one online just to make sure we include our online participants, and we'll take both questions at the same time. We started a little bit later, so we can go a tiny bit later.
There was actually an additional question online, but the first question we got was from a colleague from Amnesty International in Somalia and Djibouti. And the colleague would be very interested in getting more information about the comparative case study approach, specifically on Somalia, and about the partner organization that will be working, if possible, to know where the partner organization is located. So where the partner organization is located in Somalia, but the comparative, I think the comparative case study approach specifically on Somalia would be the first point. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. What a fascinating panel or fireside chat, as you called it, to hear about your project in more depth. I'm a lecturer here in the politics department. So my question, I've got two related questions, really coming out of research I've done on Myanmar and following on Noon's presentation, but they may have relevance to some of the other issues and cases you're looking at. So the first one, in so many of these situations of prolonged armed conflict, Myanmar being such a prime example of this, but we see it in places like Sudan and DRC as well. When the exit options or some kind of comprehensive peace strategy to reduce armed conflict is not available and not a realistic project or prospect in the next few years, it seems that agencies like the Foreign Office are increasingly looking towards meso-level or regional or subnational solutions. Obviously not ideal solutions, but like practical interim points of leverage and engagement by which armed conflict might be reduced and therefore risks of harm to civilians might be reduced. To what extent are you able to look at those kind of meso or subnational sort of entry points? And then a related question, again, it may fall outside the area of the study, but I was interested in your thoughts, is on scenarios where militaries are exacerbating and scaling up violence because they're being backed into a corner. Myanmar's current regime being a classic example of this. What kind of exit options do you think are viable? Of course, some of them may contradict human rights and international humanitarian law norms and rules, but are there sort of exit options that you're thinking about that may help reduce harm to civilians in terms of encouraging or incentivizing armed actors to reduce targeting civilians? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we'll start with the Somalia question. We also have two organizations in the room represented by Joshua and Pascal who might be able to speak about that context.
Maybe just quickly start. Yeah, in Somalia you have many armed actors from the Somali National Forces, but you have also the Somaliland de facto authorities, which have their own armed forces. You have Puntland Darwish, you have clan militia, you have Al-Shabaab, of course, and I think our case study will focus on Al-Shabaab. I cannot say now exactly where and all the details regarding the location, but we used to work and we still work with some local partners and experts. And we published recently a study on Al-Shabaab evolution and relation with civilians and civilians, survival strategies in areas controlled by Al-Shabaab. But I think the comparative element will be more across case studies, so not necessarily within the case of Somalia, because we'll focus to be confirmed on one group.
I mean, maybe I'll just add that in this research, we're coming on to support, work by Pascal and the rest. And for us, a lot of it is about engagement with the humanitarian actors in the field. And so we already have some relationships with some humanitarian actors that are involved across the region, Eastern Central Africa and the Horn, but Somalia as well. And we hope that during this process, we, in a sense, bring in a lot of the insights from the humanitarian actors that have evidence of the lived experiences of the different communities in Somalia who have evidence of the impact of that violence. So we will, in a sense, continue to support at that level. In that sense, it would be good to get in touch with Amnesty and the persons in the field who are able to share that knowledge and that information.
Thank you so much. And if I may, I would like to direct the question on peace strategies that are particularly challenging to the context that was not named, but that is really relevant right now. in Ukraine, what are the kinds of strategies that are happening at the subnational level that potentially agencies are reaching out for in this extremely complicated environment of the overarching conflict?
Yeah, in full transparency, speaking for Civic here, we do focus our efforts in non-occupied Ukrainian territory. And as I had referred to in my initial remarks, there is, of course, a lot of room to at least mitigate harm, to prevent harm also when it comes to different measures that either the civilians themselves can take, but also where the Ukrainian military can do many things, or other local authorities or national authorities to mitigate the harm that is perpetrated by the adversary in this context. So yes, without currently at least any immediate promise to end the conflict, of course, that doesn't mean that there's no ways to mitigate and reduce protection or civilian harm that is occurring. And I think there it's again really something to focus on what are local CSOs, local grassroots communities, local authorities able to do themselves or in conjunctions with all those Ukrainian actors to move the needle there. And then we see that in different ways. I mentioned some examples before, access to information ecosystems, shelters, evacuation, etc. There's a lot that can be done, even if prospects for peace right now and conflict resolution are not that immediate.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to actually come back to Noon to think about these kinds of contexts that Clara mentioned, where the military exacerbates the violence and where the viable exit options are really difficult to imagine. What could be those viable exit options and strategies?
Thank you for the question. I would say that nobody can predict Myanmar future. Currently in the country, so there are the two main groups, opposition and the military regime. So military regime, they governed for over 70 years after the independence. Anyhow, they changed their leader only. Anyhow, they didn't change their governance system. So that's why the opposition group, before that time military group in 2021, the oppositions were only ethnic people. So that's why the ethnic armed organizations were opposition before the 2021. After the 2021, not only ethnic, but also especially Burmese people. Burmese people, now they are about the 350 PDF, People Defense Force. So they are large, a huge amount of the soldiers. So every day, the armed conflict is escalating every day. So that's why international community, they try to engage in the current opposition group and the military regime, but including the ethnic armed organization and the NUG, National Unity Government, and the NUCC, National Unity Consultative Council, and also including the PDF, they don't want to engage with military regime because of this. All of Myanmar people suffered under the violence of extreme violence, of extreme violations of human rights and human dignity. So that's why they decided that this would be the last time to release from the cover of the violation of the dictatorships. So that's why currently, honestly, I would say that high tension is very high. So this is very difficult. Even UK FCDO and also UK government also try to engage in that current situation, but very difficult. And also China can, because after the 127 operation, was October 27, 2023. So that's why the ethnic armed organizations, 3 ethnic armed organizations, ATNLA and MND, they seize and capture over the 350 350 military bases and camps, including the generals. They capture the generals, colonels, and over 70,000 military senior officials. Anyhow, because of a High-End agreement led by the China foreign minister. So anyhow, High-End agreement, but violated by the military junta. So that's why the where can we engage? How can we engage? Anyhow, including me, we Myanmar people, we never surrender, we never give up to find the peaceful our situation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Noon. I think we have perhaps 2 minutes for one last question that we
This is a general question.
Yeah.
How do the people part of the project and everyone involved, including the communities, strategize in keeping everyone safe from violence or being targeted? Has your project presence ever been seen as non-neutral?
I actually would really like to direct this question to Rocco for a moment, because we had this discussion today and there are some concrete decisions that are being made right now within the team to preserve certain ways in which local communities are viewing partner organizations, etc. So if I may pass that to you, that'd be great.
Thank you. Yes, it's a great question. We did really dwell on it today because for organizations that are operational, so like Wartime, we have an office in Baghdad, in Iraq, and we've got field offices around the country. We're there with the permission of the state and the permission of the community. We're there because we have a mission to support the protection of children. So we're accepted to be there because of that. Now, if we go beyond that, we start talking about other issues, sensitive issues, then it questions why we're there. Our neutrality is questioned. What's the agenda we bring? Even if the agenda is the continued protection of children. So this is one of the big challenges we've been discussing as a research project. What is the barrier that we can come up to, or the line we can come up to? But if we cross over it and explore new areas, we start to, the questions start to be asked about our intentions. And we've had some really creative discussions as to how you can go up to that line, but then find other ways of finding those answers. We don't have to be the one that goes to approach an armed organization or a state armed force. There are many other actors that are engaging with them. There are community members. There are different ways in which we can find the same information and have a successful project, but respecting those boundaries. And I think to some extent that goes for all of the partners as well. We all have our own mandates and our reputations that bring us here together to work together, but must be protected, and we must be careful.
Can we have a few more minutes?
Well, shall we ask the room and the online?
I actually wanted to pass this same question for a moment elsewhere, because we've heard of barriers, but we haven't really heard of, well, when you do engage with armed actors, what is your strategy? And I think that Matt is really well positioned to start thinking about that.
Thank you. Well, it depends, of course, on the armed groups that you have to deal with. But the most important thing is if you approach armed group with prejudice or with superiority, or you're going to teach them these pretensions, it will not work. So if you approach them to say, okay, let's look together what is working, what is not working, and then let's see if we can identify your needs to improve together. I think this is with a positive approach and with an inclusive approach and with a transparency. It is very important. And also, all of us for the armed groups, their security is very important. So your neutrality is very important, and your behavior in this sense is very important. I mean, there are different elements that you have to take into account before engagement, but also you have to do your homework before to understand what is their policy, what are their practices, and if you don't do your homework before engage them, you can face problems. Therefore, I think understand the methodologies how to approach Bangalore before going to knock on the doors. So therefore, in this sense, I think the positiveness and inclusiveness is very important in opening the doors and keeping the door open.
So I think what we've heard from these really distinct accounts is that we will have to be extremely contextually oriented in thinking about research ethics. And this was a part of the day today, which I get very excited about, and where indeed we have to start with an approach that is based on understanding ethics, not as this moment in time where we receive an approval. It's a reflexive process from when we were constructing the bid to now. Even conceptualization is guided in important part by questions of research ethics to this next stage that we're going into, which is operationalizing our concepts, our research questions in ways that first and foremost protect research participants, but also are oriented to a much broader vision of who we need to consider, from the researchers themselves to the organizations they are attached to or working within, to a variety of gatekeepers, translators, interlocutors that are not necessarily viewed as core research participant groups, but are certainly impacted by the things that we will be doing. So that reflection is a crucial part of the work, and it will take us a very long time to figure out in an iterative way in the conversation between the research teams in the case study countries, the kind of academic counterparts where the ethics committees sit, the various risk assessment and safeguarding practices within partner organizations. And that is only the start of the kind of infrastructure that will help us understand who, how might be affected by the kinds of questions that we're thinking of asking, by the kinds of research sites that we're thinking of accessing, and whether we need to rethink completely our strategy. And if in any context the answer is yes, we will have to be adaptable and we will have to work creatively, like Rocco highlighted, and I'm really glad that that was the takeaway, so as to prioritize the protection of everybody involved in the research, and perhaps use imaginative strategies to fill the gaps that we cannot fill through fieldwork, through engagement, direct engagement with research participants. So I think we have so many tools at our disposal, and we will rely on those other tools whenever we even sense that we need to. So I think that research ethics conversation is going to continue in the lifespan of the project and actually beyond, to dissemination, to the kinds of insights that we can share and the kinds of insights that we will have to be very, very careful about as well. And on that cautionary note, we might end this part of the conversation today, but it doesn't mean that we won't open doors to engagement in various forums later down the road. And we are extremely grateful to you for being interested, for asking questions, for pushing us to think about certain areas, and to everybody on the panel, everybody in the consortium who has put so much effort and passion into what will be a really challenging but extremely important and exciting piece of work. Thank you all very much.